So with that, I welcome you all. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you're dialing in from. We welcome you to this learning engagement, which is brought to you by the ICF Mumbai Charter Chapter. Um, Let me start by introducing myself and the hosting team. So my name is Anuradha Sant. I am your host and I'm absolutely privileged to be in this position today. With me in the hosting team, we have Tushima Mukherjee and Anju Saini, who's also our newest member in the team. All of us are coaches and all of us are members of the ICF Mumbai Charter Chapter. We are volunteers with the learning management team. So with that, I once again welcome each and every one of you. Today's expert speaker is none other than Jeremy Robinson. He will be leading us in this session on the use of self-awareness, vulnerability, and story stewardship in coaching. This topic is a unique blend of the three aspects that are relevant and resonant. The topic also reflects the unique blend of disciplines that are Jeremy's expertise. But we won't tell you about that or about him. You will hear from him, you will hear about him from one of his former clients. And so I'm going to introduce her to you, and she in turn will introduce Jeremy to you. So we are pleased to introduce to you Vidhu Bansal Dev. Vidhu is a vice president in GlaxoSmithKline, and she leads the prescription to OTC switch and digital transformation R&D. With over 20 years in the pharmaceutical industry, Vidhu has built a strong reputation on the strength of her achievements in leading businesses and innovations. Further, she's been an adjunct faculty member at the pharmacy program at Rutgers University. I hope I got the name right.
Yes.
Vidhu also serves as the executive sponsor for the Asian Employee Resource Group and is a part of the US Inclusion and Diversity Council for GSK Consumer Healthcare. She mentors many individuals and is a strong advocate for talent development, diversity, and inclusion. Vidhu, a warm welcome to you and thank you for joining us today for this session. We are eager to know about Jeremy from you, so please do the honors.
Thank you so much, Anuradha and the ICF chapter and Tushima for having me, and for Jeremy for giving me this honor of introducing him. I'm really, really humbled. You know, I was born and brought up in the US, but my parents are from Varanasi and Rajasthan. So I've spent at least two months of every year of almost my entire life in India. And I have a very strong affinity for India, and my extended family still resides in India. So when Jeremy asked me to do this, it really warmed my heart to have this opportunity today. I have been very fortunate in my career, and I crossed paths with Jeremy when I would say I was facing one of the biggest challenges of my career, which was I was very much exposed to unconscious bias, discrimination by a very senior leader who was a British lady in our company. She's no longer there now. She just could not bear the thought of an Indian woman with a strong track record, delivering big innovations to market, being in her succession plan or in any kind of plan with regards to career development. And this experience really rattled me. It was unexpected. It may be common, but it was uncommon to me. And Jeremy was kind of the gift that was given to me in that moment to coach me through this very difficult time, because it has, as you can imagine, an impact on a person emotionally. It has an impact on you. You start doubting yourself. And Jeremy has a very unique coaching style, because what he does is he validates the problem so that for you, you feel, okay, it's not in my head. It's not something I'm imagining. It is truly a real issue. And he's able to gain a very deep understanding of the pain points by talking to the stakeholders who surround your ecosystem within the organization, and becomes an advocate in many different ways for you, and gives you the guidance that you really need. And I really needed it to navigate this very sensitive and difficult time in my career. Jeremy really encouraged me, be your authentic self. Don't doubt who you are. Show your sense of humor. It sounds a bit silly and maybe elementary, but I kind of was, I was holding back who I was because I felt I was walking on eggshells. I had to be a certain way and present a certain way because this person despised me so much. And Jeremy was kind of continuously infusing energy in me and telling me, no, you need to be who you are throughout this process and be what comes. Have that courage, have that strength. And not to change the qualities I bring to who I was and to my role and to the organization. So he really advised me on storytelling and how it can bring greater advocacy for you, irrespective of what challenge you're facing with your stakeholder groups. So in the end, Jeremy brought to life a quote that was famously said by a very known woman, Condoleezza Rice. And she said, my father once said to me, if somebody doesn't want to sit next to you because you're Black, that's fine as long as they move. So in other words, don't take somebody else's prejudice on you. It's their fault, it's their problem, not your problem. And don't be disabled by people who may have a prejudice. And I never told Jeremy this, but after he coached me, I was actually nominated for the KPMG Women of the Year for GlaxoSmithKline that year. It wasn't something I ever thought I would get given this situation I just shared with you. And I actually got to meet Condoleezza Rice, someone who I have so much respect and admiration for. And she said this quote in that conference when I was appointed there. And it just made me so much more appreciate what Jeremy did for me and how he allowed me to kind of hold my ground, keep my authenticity, and continue my leadership in a way that I felt was the most empowering. So with that, I'm extremely honored to introduce Jeremy Robinson. He is a phenomenal coach and expert in this space. So Jeremy, I'm passing to you.
Wow. You sure you're talking about me? That was a great story, Vidhu. Thank you so much. I love it. I love your persistence and capability and the difficult things that you came through. I don't know exactly the toll that experience was taking on you, but I congratulate you for your grit. So often a key component of anybody being able to be successful in the world and enduring a difficult, very difficult situation. Yes, so I've had a lot of experience as a coach, probably as much as any coach you're going to run into. I've probably coached around 600 leaders or so in my 30+ year career as an executive coach. That would probably add up to about 35,000 coaching hours, if anybody's counting, plus or minus. So I've had a fair amount of flight time being able to get a kind of a consistency in terms of how I work. I do and teach executive coaching. I have done a smattering of life coaching. I have a background previous to being a coach of being a psychotherapist. So I've been helping people most of my life, which I feel very grateful for. It's been a gift that kind of keeps on giving, that to be able to help other people and who are suffering and difficult straits sometimes is a fortunate thing in life. It gives you a good perspective on how fortunate you are. Yeah, along the way, I've discovered, actually, before along the way, I discovered coaching, discovered storytelling, in that prior to my work as a coach, I was a writer, a published poet. I was a newspaper reporter, and I had some very gifted writers who were mentors to me. I had a writer named Isaac Bashevis Singer, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, who was a mentor of mine and a fabulous human being. I had another writer named Ernie Gaines, African-American writer, who wrote a book called The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, extraordinary book. And some poets like James Dickey, James Merrill, George Hoppen, who won the Pulitzer Prize in the US. So I've been around some people who are pretty good storytellers, and they've taught me a thing or two about first, listening to stories, because I have always loved listening to stories, as well as language and telling stories. So as we begin here, let's turn to some slides. I will sort of come off, I will use the slides as guidance, and go back and forth and come off them, but use them for a kind of a map as we go through the presentation. So this is what we're going to be talking about: self-awareness, vulnerability, story stewardship in coaching. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I love that. Who did that graphic? It's so good. Nice job. So we'll be operating under what we call in the US Las Vegas rules, which basically means what gets said here stays here. But more than that, I want to build in some norms around what was remarked on earlier. It's so important to have a feeling of psychological safety for us to do our best work, so we can feel vulnerable with one another and take exciting risks. I'm come to mind with Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety, which I would urge you to dive into. Next slide, please. So by creating a norm around vulnerability, I want to, and I apologize, I'm going to be reading this, take a quote from Brené Brown from her book, Dare to Lead. She said, in 2014, standing across from several hundred military special force soldiers on a base in the Midwest, I decided to stop evangelizing about vulnerability, and I nailed my argument with a single question. Next slide. I looked at these brave soldiers and said, vulnerability is the emotion that we experience during times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Can you give me a single example of courage that you've witnessed in another soldier or experienced in your own life that did not require experiencing vulnerability? Complete silence, crickets. Finally, a young man spoke up. He said, no, ma'am, 3 tours. I can't think of a single act of courage that doesn't require managing massive vulnerability. Next slide. So here I love this presentation of the way, at least in American culture, a lot of people are looking at courage as something that has to keep us armored, something that doesn't allow us to have access to our feelings, something that doesn't allow us to be our real or more authentic selves. And Brené Brown is questioning that. She's saying that it's actually the opposite. If we're going to be courageous, we need to be truly interdependent. We need to truly be able to find out who is with us and who we can be with, because in these situations, as a client of mine said to me yesterday, who is an African-American woman who graduated from West Point and was a helicopter pilot. when we're not aware of these things and we're in the military, people die. So going through the concept of vulnerability opens up something for us to be more present, both for ourselves and our clients, models that we can use in terms of being able to change. We're going to do a breakout group on this, which is really about storytelling. So what I want to refer back to is the storytelling guide that you received as part of your pre-reads, which basically, to summarize for those of you who haven't read it or scanned it, says that storytelling is not just about being able to talk about your accomplishments. It is that to a certain extent, but it's also not that. It's about being able to talk about your real, authentic self, so people who are in the audience listening to you can relate to you. So we're not saying, I'm great because I did this, I'm great because I did that, I'm great because I did this. It's like those kind of speeches usually create numbness on the part of the audience after about a minute or a minute and 45 seconds. Effective stories have an arc, they have character, they have conflict, they have plot. It's important that we be protagonists in our own stories or have protagonists in the story we tell. When we are vulnerable in our storytelling, we are certainly more believable. People can relate to us and they trust us. So why do we want to be able to tell stories as coaches? I thought the whole idea of being coaches was we are essentially story catchers. We're receivers of coaching, we're receivers of stories. What is Jeremy talking about storytelling for coaches for? Well, that's a good question. I'm talking about storytelling for coaching, for coaches, because this is how we can create traction for our work. Inevitably, whether you work as a life coach or a corporate coach, an executive coach, somebody will ask you, the HR person or your client or a stakeholder in the organization, what's your approach to coaching? What's your approach to coaching? What's your lens? How do you do it? Do you have any success stories? I mean, you obviously have to disguise the client, but what's happened? How do we know we should hire you? How do I know I should pay you? What's the deal here anyway? So this is the opportunity for us to be able to demonstrate our ability to be storytellers in a very useful way, very practical way to create more business for ourselves. So here's what I suggest.
Hi.
Yes.
So we're just at 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So I'll move on in this a little bit quicker, but I appreciate the reminder. So what we want to do when we tell these stories is we want to show, not tell. We want to talk about specific experiences. We want to capture the listener's attention by having maybe what's called in music writing a hook line at the beginning. We want to be able to speak in some other tone of voice other than a monotone. We want a very sentence structure or sentence length. And here's another key. We want to practice our stories like experienced actors. We want to be able to have stories that we can memorize, or at least a 5-minute segment of a story that we memorize, so that we can use the story in multiple ways, including the famous situation when we get stuck. We all get stuck. Sometimes we feel intimidated. Sometimes we freeze. So the value of having a rehearsed story that we tell about ourselves, about our work, about our coaching is we can use it in those moments when we're stuck or we found ourselves frozen, to unfreeze. And after we're going for about 2 or 3 minutes, lo and behold, you find your voice again. You find your natural rhythm and your cadence, because it's right there. It's on the shelf. You've memorized it. If somebody woke you up in the middle of the night, you could start reciting it. But you don't just recite it. You tell it with feeling and with intonation. So that's my recommendation for you. And that's the first thing I want to help us create here in terms of kind of a tripartite way of talking about stories and coaching, is that we can be great experts on stories, but part of that expertise comes from being able to tell the stories with vulnerability. So let's go to our next slide, please. So I'd like you to go to a breakout group, breakout groups. We're going to have breakout groups, I believe, of 10 people and less each. And I'd like you, the task is to tell a story for approximately 3 minutes each that allows you to show some vulnerability about yourself in terms of any way you want to do it, in terms of your work, in terms of something that's gone on in your life recently, and use some of the guidelines that I've suggested in storytelling. I would like the group to appoint a facilitator for the group so that you don't each kind of wait for the next person, the next person, the next person. And I'd like each group to report a reporting person who will take notes and summarize to the larger group, which will be, that reporting person will then relay those notes into the chat, which we will debrief when we all come back together. So hopefully that's clear. You'll get notice, I guess, you'll be notified in your breakout groups, which will take place for 20 minutes when you're about to wind down. I think that maybe there should be a timer person also who times and lets them know, everybody know that when the 3 minutes is just about up. So that's the assignment for us getting started by being storytellers ourselves. Are there any questions I need to know about that I didn't cover? If not, I would like you to go to the breakout groups and start practicing.
Jeremy, I'm going to send people to the room. So about 9 or 10 per room. Is that fine?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. All right. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So what I'd like to do now is to have the folks who are the report out folks to write in the chat one question or one summary from their breakout group that emerged. And Tashima will relay that to us or to me, and I will comment or ask a further question on that. And we'll spend about 10 minutes doing that. But before we do that, just to kind of warm up because it's going to take you a couple of minutes to put that stuff in the chat. I think that there were some questions you said came up, Tashima, that arose during the time that this workshop was down.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So there are about 12 or 13 questions that really came in, which were really strong and open-ended questions.
well, maybe we'll get like a third of them. Okay, great. Go. Can you relate? Can you start to read
Maybe
them?
the ones related to stories we can start with first.
Yeah. So do you want me to read out a question now, Jeremy, or do you want to relay the comments that have come in the chat box?
No, let's start with a couple of those from registration.
Okay. All right. So one of the questions that came in is, if you look at these characteristics, self-awareness, vulnerability, story stewardship, how essential are these characteristics in a coach?
absolutely essential. I mean, I don't see somebody being able to do coaching at a mastery level without it. So it's very simple for me. I mean, I guess you could do coaching without it, but I don't see you could do any masterful coaching without it.
There was another question which was more related to story stewardship. What are some practical approaches that have worked according to you, which will help us as coaches tell stories with impact?
Is that a question about story stewardship or about telling stories with impact? Because it's two different things mentioned.
Storytelling. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess part of it is how evocative is the story? How does it, so if you're practicing and you want to be practicing the story that you're going to tell as the coach, how does it, how to, you know, you can wear out your friends and family telling them stories, but how are they reacting to it? Are they moved in some way? Is it creating some kind of emotion or inspiration, or is something happening besides the story being told? That's what I would look for if I was the coach. Are we ready for any questions from the breakout groups, or do we want to do another question?
So we have some comments that have been posted by one of the groups. They've shared.
Great.
You know, the takeaways. Okay, so Shanti from room 9 has shared some of the things that came up. Is personal but void of shame, fear, and judgment.
Say again?
Personal but void of shame, fear, and judgment. And Shanti, if you want to step in and build any context around this, go ahead, please.
Sure. Things started with an I language. That's why I've put down that it was a very personal thing. Everybody used an I, this happened to me, and I language. All the stories had lots of vulnerability, completely void of any shame, fear, of judgment from others who were listening in. It had lots of emotions, memories, nostalgia, relationships, and humor built in as people narrated the stories. It had a storyline. There was a beginning, there was a body ending, which you could clearly catch. And the ending definitely had turning points, which had surprise elements, was inspirational, motivational, or had a powerful message that others could take back. Was very human, relatable, and that actually acted as a conversation starter because others added to it and said, you know, this happened to me also, I am able to relate to it, kind of a thing happened, and brought out different perspectives about a very similar situation that others had experienced.
That sounds wonderful. I'm sorry I missed it. So it was people found ways of becoming more empathetic with each other.
Yeah.
Which is also something that happens from storytelling, is that people become more empathetic. That's why they are teaching doctors about narration, because they want doctors to become more empathetic, which they need to become.
Yeah, that's it from room number 9, unless anybody else wants to add to it.
Other rooms?
Tushima, if I may go for room 5.
Yeah, Sarita, I was just going to prompt you.
I'm not going to repeat what Shanti just mentioned, but what I would like to add is that almost everyone ended with the struggle they are still experiencing in accepting maybe setbacks, failures, or their own journey of self-awareness. I think that's a big thing to talk in front of strangers and say, you know, I still am not there. Right, I'm struggling, or I still pause, or I still feel the pain, you know, or I feel I lead 2 different lives and I'm still not coming to terms with it. So I think that was, for me at least, it was a very big takeaway, that you could open up to strangers, or maybe because we were strangers, we found it easy. And that's my question to you, Jeremy. Do we sometimes feel easy or to talk to people we don't know and maybe not meet again, and that's why we share and be more open? And be more open to vulnerability.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, so much of my work is focused around coaching leaders and trying to help them be better leaders and help others identify with them. But I think to your point, which is a wonderful point, talking about how we're stuck. When I've been in the room when a leader has talked about, or I've heard about a leader talking about how she or he is stuck, that's very empowering to people who are listening. Everybody in the room can relate to that leader. Otherwise, with a leader, there can be enormous separation. And if you're a leader of an organization of, 50,000 people or 100,000 people, how are you going to get people to relate to you? So there's a real dilemma there. So part of what a leader needs to deconstruct, I think, if they're really great, is how can they demonstrate some humanity by their storytelling? And part of it is by having the courage to be vulnerable in the way that you just demonstrated in terms of what happened in your group, that there is that identification moment in good storytelling when the person says, I really don't know. I'm trying to figure this out. And everybody in the room can say, yeah, I've been there. I'm still there now, or I remember when, or I hope that it doesn't happen again, because we're all more similar than otherwise, and we're all human. So, terrific point.
Thank you. But Jeremy, my question is this easy to do when you're with strangers? This opening up and accepting struggle?
I guess it depends upon the person. For some people, it's easier to do with strangers. For others, I guess, there's a certain anonymity in that feels safe.
Thank you.
The comment from Wilson Tay, and he shared that in their group, the learning was that any meaningful progress and growth is built on vulnerability and acceptance. So you can only be strong when you first recognize your own weaknesses and limitations. This was the takeaway from his group.
Yeah, it's great takeaway. I love it. I think there's a lot of wisdom. It's self-acceptance is funny. It's not funny, haha. It's odd in the sense that it seems to be a key to being able to be, for any of us to be able to change. So, which is one of the things I've discovered in my journey of helping people and myself, is for any of us to be able to grow, we need to be able to self-observe, right? But some funny things happen around self-observation. It doesn't always work for some people initially, because for some people, they use the self-observation as a way to become even more self-critical. It doesn't help them separate something that they're observing about themselves to be able to improve. For many people, it does, but for some people, it doesn't work. It becomes something else to be angry at themselves about. So the question becomes then, how do they use that observation, which is difficult, to neutralize the feelings about that and not have self-hate? How do we use that to calm it down so that it can truly be an observation? Because if we can calm it down and we don't have self-hate, then we can really observe. But if energy from the self-observation is going into self-criticism and self-hate, we will not ever have the energy to change, because all the energy is getting recycled in the wrong way, right? So it sounds very simple, but it's something that's key to us being able to, because we can see stuff, but can we see it in a neutral way that we might not like it? We might not like it, but can we neutralize it enough that we can then act on it and do something about it? That's the key to any kind of behavioral change, no matter what lens we have as a coach, whether we're operating out of cognitive behavioral or narrative coaching or existential coaching or emotional intelligence, whatever it is. that part is key.
As you've been answering that, Jeremy, there's one person in the audience who's just raised her hand. So do you want to take that question or comment now?
Sure.
Okay, Clara,
Yes.
go ahead.
So room 4, I'm just, even though we didn't really, they didn't assign me to talk about it, but I have to say that one thing that was really beautiful is seeing the courage. In general, the stories were related to big life-changing events. Specifically during COVID or before. So really taking a step forward into changing their lives or changing their career or finding a new purpose for their life. And it shows how even after 20 or 25 years of really being successful in something, and then you take the step forward into going into a new venture and a new adventure. And courage is something that is really to me, when it comes to stories, is showing those two, this vulnerability of not being able to overcome it yet, or talking about their difficulties during, and at the same time showing the courage to take the step and to really accept the possibility of failure or exploring something new. But I actually have one question, Jeremy, and I don't know if what I've noticed, us being coaches, it's either me or with my chapter, when we talked about this, that sometimes when we enter into the coaching, we become even more critical about ourselves. So it feels like we tell ourselves that we should know better, or we know better, or we should be able to deal with things in a better way. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's unfortunate. I mean, it's, we enter into some kind of, we all have these internal saboteurs, right? So we enter, the saboteur gets louder. And even though we maybe know better in our minds, it's important to be accepting and empathetic. It's hard, it's like care for the caretakers, right? We need help in terms of being able to readjust that mindset and practice that vulnerability and self-acceptance. So it's a journey. This is why we need peers. This is why we need supervisors. This is why we need mentor coaches. This is why we need spouses and friends. It's hard to do this work in any kind of isolation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Clara. Jeremy, we do have quite a few more comments and questions, and we have a couple of others who've raised their hand. But in the interest of time, is it okay if we go to slides now?
Yeah,
and
let's
then but when we come back next time, Archana, Sumita, you get first shot at saying whatever you want to say. Is that fine? Thank you. Let's move ahead.
It's a very rich discussion. So thank you all for your experiences. Hopefully you had an experience in your first breakout groups. I wanted to kind of help you guys get into the water just to start and just have this experience of being the storyteller, because that's sometimes not something that we practice as coaches. And I would urge you to continue to do this with your colleagues, or in supervision, or however you manifest the work that you're doing together with colleagues. So I did kind of miss a slide that I wanted to come back to and talk about something Brene Brown said about vulnerability, which is sort of a caveat, and that's the slide we're going to look at next. So that's slide number 8. And that's where she says, vulnerability minus boundaries is not vulnerability, it's confession, manipulation, desperation, or shock and awe, but it's not vulnerability. Vulnerability for vulnerability's sake is not effective, useful, or smart. I mean, this is kind of common sense, but I think it needs to be said whenever we talk to our clients or we talk to people about vulnerability. We're not just talking about what psychologists call spilling. We're not talking about that. We're talking about practicing kind of an openness, but an openness which is purposeful, intentional, if you will. So just an important note to continue to make, that there's a boundary around being able to be vulnerable. Boundaries are important for us to have psychological safety as well. Okay, so now we're going to go to slide, I think, 10. So I want you to continue to do the storytelling exercise, if you will, and practice that. I'm going to move on to, we have so much stuff to cover. The idea of story stewardship. That next slide, please. This is another new idea from Brene Brown. She's remarkable. And she feels that the issues that most of us struggle with are being the knower, advice giving and problem solving. Problem solving is tough because some people do want to help. The best story stewardship in these moments is just to say, I'm grateful that you're sharing this with me. What does support look like? What does support look like? I can listen and be with you. I can be problem solver or whatever else you need, you tell me. So, I mean, as coaches, this I think resonates with us very well because this is pretty much coaching language where we are hearing the story and not hopefully being the advice giver, but just being able to kind of surround the person and figure out with this story, how are they going to solve the story, if you will. So I would like to us to use this as another exercise going forward. So next slide, please. So I would like you to consider this in terms of how you maybe you probably many of you already do this, but as a coach, as you're receiving stories, how are you in fact story stewards, and when do you step into this and when do you step away from this? So if you can also, as you go into your breakouts, which is going to be for 15 minutes this time in the same groups, think of ways that you have received stories where you were more of a story steward and ways that you couldn't be the story steward. You had to comment, you had to advise. And what was different for each of you when you were able to be a story steward of your client's story and you were able to just kind of like have some, I guess, stewardship around the story and the times that you weren't? What did you notice in terms of your work with that client? So same deal, breakouts, same facilitator for the groups and report outs. This one will be for 15 minutes. Okay? And bring your summaries back to put in the chat. Those of you.
So Jeremy, we do have a moving population. So I think Tushima will try her best to get the same people in the room. But in case we don't do that, we still will have a reasonable size in the breakout room for us to do this work.
Yeah, we will have rooms with at least 5 or 6 people. Some rooms will have more.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think we will manage to get most of the people back in the same rooms, more or less. Okay,
Okay.
so rooms are opening now.
Great, thank you so much.
Everyone's back, thanks, in 15 minutes.
Thank you so much. Welcome back. Hopefully this continues to be a rich experience. We're already running behind, which is my fault. I apologize, but I just wanted to do so much with you guys. So we're just going to have time for probably about 2 comments before I get back to the slides. And then there's another breakout I want you guys to have, which we're going to shorten to 10 minutes. But let's turn it back to Tushima in terms of the comments that are going to get from people who didn't get to comment before.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd request all groups to please put your comments and takeaways in the chat box. And as promised, I'm going to invite the 2 persons who raised their hand last time, but we couldn't take questions. So Archana first, and then Sumita. So Archana, all yours.
Yeah, so I wanted to make an observation when we were doing the first exercise, Jeremy and everyone. So when we went into the breakout, the first 2 to 2.5 minutes there was silence, and the way I looked at it was when we were talking about vulnerability. One is of course giving respect to each other in the room, that allowing whoever wants to go first. But the other thought in my head was, it takes courage to be vulnerable. I think somewhere all of us were also answering this question, who's going to go first? And the moment the first person goes, I think we saw people opening up and very candidly sharing their stories. So I think the way I looked at it at that point of time is that for me, courage and vulnerability go hand in hand, So I think that was just an observation I wanted to share. That's all.
I love that observation. I think that's something to keep in mind if you use this in a group setting and you're using an exercise with that there's a power of people in the silence of kind of like getting ready to kind of wade into the water. And it sounds like your group was very respectful of that, and that helped people feel like they could then be vulnerable.
Thank you.
And can I request people to, I think, focus on this particular report out of the second breakout room? That will be helpful for taking the discussion forward.
Thank you.
Okay, Sumita, if you have something related to this time's breakout, could you
Sure.
let us know? Yeah.
Yeah. So what I would like to share is, in our group, we shared about how we as coaches have been experiencing, stories from our clients. So many of us rather shared that we sometimes, listen to them, we start listening to them, and then we get sometimes attached to the story. That was specifically for me, attaching myself to the story and, giving it some kind of judgment and trying to problem solve. So that was the narrative I had for myself. A couple of people in our group shared about, not being able to interrupt the client while they were sharing their story. And the intention overall of the group was to be more intentional while listening to the story and sharing the story in terms of the relevance of the context, in terms of also how the client wants us to handle the story, whether he wants us to be a listener, a problem solver, someone who can just be a counselor, or, a mentor in all forms. So that was what came out of the group.
That's great comments. I agree that sometimes, we're human beings. Sometimes we're always human beings, and sometimes we get triggered by something that somebody says, and all of a sudden we're gone from the session for 5 minutes because we got lost in being triggered. So that happens. That's going to happen, and you just need to be able to be aware of that. But if you can come back to then. If you have in your mantra something about being a story steward, I think it does help you align more with the client. And actually, I think it helps with the boundaries also. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. And I also feel that sometimes, we experience that when the client wants to share a story, but is not sure whether he should, then sometimes sharing my own story helps the client, open up a little bit more. And feel that he's not the norm.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think we have to be a little bit self-regulated about that, and not just become, be self-aware about that. But yes, definitely that for somebody who's shyer, less verbal, more introverted, this is the power of storytelling. I mean, I've worked with people who've maybe had difficulties with language or very introverted, and through their practicing, especially when I've done groups, being a storyteller in groups and telling their story over time, over 3 or 4 or 5 groups, it's remarkable what that does for their self-confidence. It's just remarkable. And I've seen enormous changes in people being able to move from real reticence about being able to say anything about themselves to a feeling of enjoyment in speaking to others. It's a wonderful thing to be able to participate with and witness.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sumita. Jeremy, before we move ahead, there's just one question which came in the chat box, which may be important now. So someone's requested if you could clarify. Could everyone else go on mute, please? Thanks. So someone's requested if you could clarify how exactly do you define story stewardship? And this was a question I too had in my mind. So how do you distinguish between story stewardship and storytelling? And what exactly is story stewardship?
Okay, storytelling, previously defined by the handout around story showing, or the elements of story showing, storytelling, containing the elements of being able to tell a tale about yourself as a fill in the blank leader, coach, whatever. I think speaks to itself. Story stewardship is where you're kind of like surrounding the story the person is telling, and you're making an inquiry about that. You're making an inquiry about you're saying to your client, if it's a client, essentially, okay, I've heard this story, but I'm not going to try to take it over as mine and interpret it or manipulate it or whatever. I'm first going to ask you about it. I'm going to be a steward of your story. I'm not going to interrupt it as yours. So I think that there's an important boundary element about what she's talking about, especially knowing her work pretty well, that the story steward has and says, okay, this is your story. How would you like me to work with it with you? Or would you like me just to observe it? So that's a differentiator, I think.
Thank you. Let's move on. We are running a little late, folks.
Okay.
So please keep your questions and comments coming in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to go to slide 15, please. So the next part of our presentation is really going to be kind of the more traditional way. I think that coaches have thought about stories, and maybe you've discussed in various trainings you've been in and classes, that we note that stories are essential to human history. They are ways of being meaning makers and learning makers, and that all human endeavors involve stories which teach and inspire. That's what we use. That's what we used before there was language. We used stories to convey what remnants we had of civilization going forward. Next slide. So there are all kinds of stories: the heroic narrative of self, the pattern integration of past, present, and future. Was discussed in the breakout, and while you were in the first breakout, about that we all have different stories that we tell ourselves. I quoted something from Walt Whitman that essentially we are all have multiple stories that we contain in ourselves. He said one time, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. There's an entire approach to coaching called narrative coaching, which is a lens that coaches use to understand their clients. Next slide. So this is what we do. We do elicit the client's story in multiple ways over multiple sessions. We use it to build our trust with them, our relationship. We use it to help them extract meaning. We help them wonder out loud in terms of developing new behaviors from what they can take out of their stories. Next slide. So if we're working with a client, we explore if they chose, for instance, to be a leader in terms of my line of work. We use empathic listening. We reframe things. Next slide. We use metaphors. We listen for some key things as story listeners. Locus of control is one of them. Are they internal and empowered, or external, victim and passive? We listen for continuity. Is there a logical flow, metaphors, learning, healing from losses? All these things tell us stuff about the story. Are there constraining beliefs that become mental models which block growth, which may dictate if we're working, say, in a cognitive behavioral lens as a coach, what the mental model came from? So we can examine or re-examine, help the client re-examine the belief system that came out of that mental model. Next slide. So we also listen for adventure, transitions, recoveries, setbacks, gripes, complaints. Robert Hargrove called these rut stories, and the other kinds of stories where things are going well, he called river stories. Next slide. So that's the foundational component of most coaching, is eliciting our client stories. And we can call it story stewardship also. That's a different way of our setting ourselves with a boundary around the client stories. It's good to be able to have these choices. How do we best use our open-ended questions? How do we provide supportive comments and restatements? How much do we talk? How do we provide nonverbal encouragement? Next slide. Sometimes they tell us more personal details, and I think that that's okay. I don't know if we're going to get into it because time is running short, but I think the piece on grieving, especially during times of COVID, when so many people have lost somebody, is important for us to be aware of, that that's going to happen sometimes as we have longer careers as coaches, that we're going to hear people talking about grieving, and that's part of what we do, that we are putting on our counselor hat sometimes. We're not seeking to intervene in their personal lives, but sometimes people need to tell these stories about loss. Next slide. Let's talk about how we elicit client stories in our breakout rooms next. Take 2 or 3 minutes each to answer these questions. What's a story that came up with your client that generated some insight for them? How did you elicit the story? How did you explore it? And how is it useful to the client? Same deal, discussion leaders, report out leaders, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more time after you come back in 10 minutes to discuss what happened in the breakout. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully, we've had you do 3 breakout groups today. You are meeting at least one new colleague that you want to continue to have a professional, personal relationship with. And that's a great takeaway for you in terms of being in this workshop for today.
Let's continue
Let's
the
go
feedback form and let's go ahead with the sharing. I don't see any raised hands. So anybody like to share?
Why don't I just go to the slides, then I'll grab the slide 26 and just finish off the slides. Okay?
Sure, done. Okay. For some reason, it goes back to the first.
Yeah, I know.
You can just type the slide number and hit enter.
Yep.
Okay, all right, now I've done it. So old-fashioned way.
So I wanted to say a few more things about listening and working with clients who are grieving. I think the handout Helping Grieving, which by the way I wrote right after 9/11, in New York, and I was going around to all these places where people are terrified and sad. I had one client who said he went to 40 funerals. This does not require us to be psychotherapists, but it does require us to have compassionate hearts. Next slide, please. So you need to remember as a coach that when you're afraid, you're concerned that the client might be going too deeply into something in their emotional life that requires you to become really a therapist instead of a coach, you have control. What's the control? The control is to be empathically silent. It's very rare that somebody will continue to talk about some deep personal problem if you're not in any way eliciting a question about that. So I said there's a hand up, but I'm going to just finish the slides. Next slide, please. So I just want you to thank you for the conversations, for the chat, additional questions. And remember that my answers are one coach's version of the truth. You need to seek and develop your own approaches to coaching, which best help your clients find their way. It's been a pleasure to be with you folks. I look forward to being with you in the additional 15 minutes. I see a hand up. Go ahead. I don't see your name, so please.
Subramani.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Subramani.
Jeremy, sometimes, I don't know. When I get into storytelling and start sharing my own experiences, I tend to become emotional. I mean, is this fine?
How does it feel for you?
No, but is this fine? I mean, that's my question, because it has happened to me a couple of times. So
yeah, does it make you feel more connected to the person you're with?
mm-hmm.
There's your answer.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Others? One last one. No pressure. Okay, well, I think we can just say thank you very much. It's been a wonderful experience of being with you folks. I hope you came away with at least one new colleague that you can be friends and have a deeper relationship as a result of being here. And hopefully you gain some insight from some of the things that we talked about and asked questions about. And remember, this is all in process for all of us. We're all continue to be learners. And one of the great things about being a coach is that it's a wisdom journey. So keep enjoying.
So as we are closing out for today, I think I'll not do my duty if I don't thank Jeremy. Jeremy, thank you so much for such an insightful and such a heartwarming session. I think as we were talking in the breakout room, time that very seldom do we talk about the subject, and very seldom do we actually take a pause to reflect upon these important topics. So thank you so much. And thank you from the bottom of our heart. As we are all leaving and inviting everybody to actually stay back for the extra 15 minutes, Jeremy has agreed to be with us. I would like to start by actually ask everybody to actually show him some love. So in the chat box, we would like to do a word cloud. My question to all of you is that put in any one thing, a word or a sentence, which was most insightful for you today. Just type it in the chat box. Don't press enter. I think you all know the drill by now. I will count down and then you could all press enter together, and we will share some of our good wishes and goodwill to Jeremy for the magnificent session that he's held for us. So quickly, 10 seconds, please write down whatever you've taken away or what was most insightful for you today. And I will count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go. Thank you so much. And with that, I will officially close the session. We do have Tushima with a list of questions which she already has. So we will take it up in the informal setting. So with that, thank you so much for being here. And I'll continue to invite you to stay back for this next 15 minutes. Thank you. And I'll close the recording.